Greetings. I'm Thomas Caldwell of the Aurelian Column, and this is a special report on the rising tensions between Russia and the United States over the situation in Ukraine. Most people have never heard the name of Vasily Artipov. Well, he was a submarine captain, a commander, actually, of a squadron of 4 submarines that in October of 1962 found themselves outside the blockade line during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, for reasons that would be quite long to go into, the submarine he was on was under the impression that they were under attack and a war had already occurred between the Soviet Union and the United States. The captain and political officer of that particular submarine had decided that the time was right to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo. In other words, a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. They were going to launch it at American ships, and that nuclear detonation would have, well, it would have ended the world. Anyways, Vasily objected. He said, "You need my consent, and I'm not giving it." He had a background and had been on a submarine that had experienced radiation poisoning and knew what it was about. There's an awful lot to that story, and I would urge people to look into it. But that one man who said no, or in Russian, "Yet," literally saved the world. Anybody hearing me today on this podcast, you exist because of that man standing up and saying, "We're not going to do this." It turned out, of course, the crew was mistaken, that there had not been a nuclear war, and the submarine went back to Russia. He is now considered the man who literally saved the world. Because the way things were going at that time, if a nuclear detonation had occurred among American ships, there would have been a full nuclear exchange between the USSR and the United States. And if you know anything about how those weapons really work, you would know that there would be no life left on Earth, at least no life to speak of. Certainly not humans. Another man who saved the world, you probably have never heard of, was Stanislav Petrov, who died just a few years ago. In 1983, he was a Soviet officer at the missile defense system of that country. The Americans had launched several nuclear missiles on the Soviet Union. He did not think it was real for many reasons, which also you should look into, and he decided not to report up the chain of command what was going on. This had just happened a few weeks after Flight 007, Korean Airlines, had been shot down. Tensions were extremely high. He decided he was going to consider it a software error in a new system that had been installed, and he was right. If he had sent that note up the chain of command, there probably would have been a full nuclear exchange, and in 1983, civilization would have been brought to an end. I find it interesting that these two men who are credited with saving everyone on planet Earth are Russians. Isn't that interesting? They were the bad guys for so many years. Unfortunately, the bad guys are in charge in the United States. Everybody knows about the attack of missiles that President Biden gave Ukraine permission to launch on Russian territory, which was done yesterday. And people are still waiting for the other shoe to drop and what Russia will do. They have put out a nuclear doctrine, which is available online from official sources, and it's pretty serious. In other words, if a nuclear-armed country, namely the United States, decides to help anyone with its weaponry or know-how, they could find themselves under attack with nuclear weapons. The Russians are not kidding around. Yet we woke up this morning to more news that the Biden administration is going to be sending landmines to Ukraine to be used against Russians, those delightful little devices that last a long time and end up taking off the limbs and killing children playing in fields. That's happened an awful lot. Most countries have banned those things. The United States and, sadly, Russia haven't. And another report that came out from Ukrainian news sources is that the Ukrainian government has been given permission by the United States to use, of all things, French, British-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles on Russian territory. Interesting how the United States has to give permission to use weapons from another country, but this is all NATO. And all these weapon systems, by the way, are manned by NATO personnel. Anybody who thinks otherwise is just being silly. So effectively, as of today, NATO is at war with Russia. And just about everybody is asking themselves, why on earth is this happening? Why is the outgoing administration in Washington, run by a rather senile man who couldn't find his way to do a photo op yesterday in Rio de Janeiro, why are they putting this much power in this man's hand? Why are they listening to him? And the people that voted for the Democratic side are also raising questions as to why they could be so naive. Other news, the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, I'm using the old term, I think it sounds nicer. The U.S. Embassy in Kiev is closed. American citizens in Ukraine are being told to shelter in place. They're expecting, well, what are they expecting? What would they expect? Ukraine is run by criminal gangs that have taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, and who knows where it's gone or who it's been kicked back to. How did we get to this point? I'm thinking back to reading about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the people on both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, were desperate to avoid war with each other. Desperate. They had known World War II. Khrushchev and Kennedy were both veterans of that conflict and had seen real nasty action up close and personal. And nuclear weapons had been detonated above ground in the 1950s up until about that time. People got to see exactly how horrifying they are. But the current presidential administration is doing everything it can to start a third world war. Do they really want to burn down everyone with them? Globalism is on the defensive, and it doesn't seem like it's going to survive. Many people within that political realm have committed crimes against their own people and, in many cases, the world at large. Yet, you know something? Right near the end, in Nazi Germany, even though Hitler and his men had gas weapons, they didn't use them. Interesting comparison, wouldn't you say? We are at the brink, people. This is very, 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 very serious. It's so serious you can't put your head around it. Countries don't get into this situation, these types of situations, if they're run by intelligent, sane people. Joe Biden had to drop out of the presidential race because he was not considered mentally competent, yet he is still in power. Or the people underneath him or above him are still controlling him. We really don't know what's going on. It's about time that we really hope and pray that there are some Americans in the military chain of command who can show the same courage that Vasily did in 1962 and Stanislav did in 1983. Somebody has to send the message down the line to stop. I would hope that somebody in the NATO chain of command can put the order down to spike the guns, shall we say, of those missile batteries in Ukraine, because they can't operate without NATO, and that's what they're doing. You could hope that somebody somewhere in the American military establishment is going to put the brakes on this thing. Disobey orders, but so what? We need to have some people in the system right now who can say no, who can say enough, who can say this is insane and we will not follow illegal orders. Only Congress, only the United States legislative branch has the power to declare war. The Biden administration is unilaterally trying to start a third world war. There's no other explanation. They're doing everything they can to burn down the house before Donald Trump takes power. We haven't seen anything like this probably since before the Civil War. In fact, we haven't really seen anything like this at all. President Buchanan, just before he left office in 1861, had really made a mess of things between the North and the South, and Abraham Lincoln came right in and, of course, had to deal with the Civil War, which was a horror. But Buchanan was just stupid. He didn't really know how to handle anything, and he didn't go out of his way to make trouble for Lincoln. No president in history has done what Biden has done. None. I can't see any example where an outgoing president is going to intentionally start a horrifying conflict that could potentially kill hundreds of millions of people, if not more, just because they want to make things difficult for the next administration. This is beyond insane. We need new vocabulary to cover this one. You know, there was a movie made some years ago, back in the 1990s, by a filmmaker who has since become synonymous with left-wing activism, but he'd actually made one Hollywood movie as a director, and it was hysterically funny at the time, and it's called Canadian Bacon, and the director's Michael Moore. Yeah, that Michael Moore, before he got really stupid. And it's a movie about the military-industrial complex going out of business because of the end of the Cold War with Russia. And the United States had to look for a new enemy, and of course they chose Canada. It's actually quite funny and quite telling, although it's hard for people outside American culture to understand since so many of the jokes are so subtle. But one of the things in the movie that was satirical was that America's nuclear arsenal was under the control of another country. Its missiles. One of the lines in that movie was, what country in their right mind would allow their missiles to be controlled by a foreign country? Think about that. That was satire. That was considered a joke. But Ukraine has control of American missiles and command of American missile personnel. You don't know what to believe when it comes to the motivations of these people. The only thing I hope for is that somewhere in the American political establishment, somewhere in the American military establishment, somewhere in the NATO chain of command, we have our own Vasily or our own Stanislav who are going to stand up and say no. And no matter what orders come down the line that command for things to go off, they will say no. Or yet. It's going to be a long wait until Donald Trump comes into office. That's it for now. I'll keep up on this story as much as is required. If you appreciate my work, please like and subscribe and share. And please consider a paid subscription. There's details of that up on the Substack channel where this podcast originates. The address there is aureliancolumn.substack.com. That's aureliancolumn.substack.com. I welcome feedback. You can reach me at feedback@aureliancolumn.com. That's feedback@aureliancolumn.com. I'm up on X, and you can reach me there at MICCAMPEN, MICCAMPEN, and other places. Until we meet again, be good, be safe, be vigilant, and remember, Clown World and the Deep State must be destroyed. Good day.